My name's Mayer-García. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. My pronouns are he, him, and al. I'm a half white, half Latino man. I'm wearing a blue tie, and there's a brick wall behind me with some wall art with sea creatures and mermaids. I'm zooming in today from my home in Bloomington, Indiana. It's the ancestral homelands of the Sawanwa, Potawatomi, Miami, and Delaware peoples, who are the current and future caretakers of this land. And I'm here to introduce the panelists. I'll be moderating today's field conversation on demystifying the plenary. We're joined by a great group of panelists who are going to share from their experiences on doing plenary presentations. So I'll just talk about the format a little bit first. I'll introduce the speakers, then we'll hear from each of them some initial comments, and then we'll move to a Q&A. So as we're going along with the initial comments of the speakers, feel free to add questions into the chat. And we hope to to engage in a great conversation. Just a few thank yous first before we get started officially. I wanted to thank Amy Zagmansky, the executive director of ASTR, also Laura McDonald, the vice president for conferences, for suggesting this topic of field conversation, as well as the 2022 Field Conversations Committee, who were a part of planning this, even though we're in 2023 now, which is Eric M. Glover, Chris Nasrat, Aviva Neff, and Diana King. So today we're joined by some amazing panelists, and thank you, each of you, for joining us and giving up your time and your expertise to share in this important and very, very important topic, and also in sharing and mentorship with ASTR. The first panelist is Patrick Anderson, who's a professor of communication and ethnic studies at University of California in San Diego. Anderson works at the interstices of performance studies and cultural studies, focusing in particular on the constitutive role of violence, mortality, and pain in the production and experience of political subjectivity. He is the author of So Much Wasted, Hunger, Performance, and the Morbidity of Resistance. He's also the author of Autobiography of a Disease, which was the winner of the ICQI Book Award and finalist for the Many Voices Prize, as well as Empathy's Others, which is forthcoming. Anderson is co-editor with Gisa Menon of Violence Performed, Local Roots and Global Roots of Conflict, and the author, interviewer, or co-author of numerous essays and book chapters in journals and anthologies. Anderson serves on the editorial boards of Women in Performance and Cultural Studies, and is co-editor with Nicholas Rideout of the Performance Works book series with Northwestern University Press. We're also joined today by Charlotte Canning, who's a professor of performance as public practice and women's and gender studies, and head of the Oscar Brockett Center for Theater History and Criticism. She is author of Feminist Theaters in the USA, Staging Women's Experience, and the most American thing in America, Circuit Chautauqua's Performance, which won the 2006 Barnett Heward Award for Outstanding Research in Theater History. Her most recent books include Representing the Past, Essays in Performance Historiography, co-edited with Tom Postlethwaite, and On the Performance Front, U.S. Theater and Internationalism, the latter of which won the Joe A. Calloway Prize. Currently, she is co-editing an anthology on global feminist performance and writing a book on the history of theater in Texas for the University of Texas Press. Michelle Lou Carriger is also with us today. They are an associate professor of theater, film, and television at UCLA. Carriger specializes in the historiography of theater performance and everyday life. Her first book project concentrates on the clothing and fashion as everyday performance in 19th century Britain and Japan. She attends especially to the ways in which notions of theatricality and clothing and fashion simultaneously articulate and mystify the discourses of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and modernity in their work upon bodies. An article excerpted from this work won the 2012 TDR Graduate Student Essay Contest Award and the 2014 Gerald Kahn Prize from ASTR. Her article, No Thing to Wear, on contemporary issues of cultural appropriation and Japanese kimono also won the Kahn Prize and the 2019 ATHA Association, or as we know, ATHA Association for Theater and Higher Education Outstanding Article Award. Carriger is the only two-time winner of the Kahn Prize. Other research includes contemporary subculture fashions with historical aesthetics, such as goth, Japanese street fashion, Gothic Lolita, and steampunk. Dr. Carriger is also a longtime practitioner of the Japanese way of tea and is at work on a book about it as contemporary practice of historical embodiment and cultural performance. Our final panelist is Patricia Ybarra. She is a professor in the Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies at Brown University. She is author of Performing Conquest, 5 Centuries of Theater History and Identity in Tlaxcala, Mexico, and co-editor with Lara Nielsen of Neoliberalism and Global Theaters, Performance Permutations. And she's also the author of Latinx Theater in the Times of Neoliberalism. She is currently working on a digital humanities project on Reza Abdo's Father Was a Peculiar Man and a monograph on Abdo and the development of queer theory. She is the former president of ATHA, a former department chair, and the recipient of Brown's Graduate Mentoring Award. She has presented at a number of plenaries, including 2 State of the Profession panels. So please help me in welcoming our panelists. And Patrick, would you like to get us started?
Sure, thank you, Eric. I'm very happy to be here. My name's Patrick Anderson. I am a white person with messy blonde hair. I'm wearing a black shirt today. I'm sitting in a room that's the color of marigolds in my house. It has lots of stuff in it, including an old piano and various objects. And in the distance, there's another room with big windows and a potted plant. You might occasionally notice a gray and white cat wandering through looking for treats. I happily respond to any pronouns. People generally use he and him with me. And I'm in San Diego, which is on unceded Kumeyaay land. Very happy to be here. A bit of my history with plenaries and with ASTR. So Patty, who's also speaking today, and I planned a conference about 10 or 11 years ago for ASTR. Immediately after that, I was the vice president of conferences for 3 years. So I've planned a lot of ASTR conferences in addition to conferences for other organizations. And I've given a few plenaries at ASTR. I also want to normalize being rejected from plenaries. I've also been rejected from lots of plenaries. It happens to all at every stage of our careers. And it's sometimes a joy and a delight to be rejected, because then you're not asked to go up on that dais and you know, have your anxiety rise in the way that it does. So completely, it is an honor to be rejected from giving a plenary. I've been thinking a lot, as I know a lot of people have, about conferences during the pandemic and what conferences historically have done well, but also historically what conferences have not done well, specifically around accessibility. Both in terms of disability accommodations and in terms of financial and other accommodations when it comes to being able to attend and participate fully in our conferences. So I was very happy to say yes to this, because I hope that our conversation about plenaries in particular can also be a conversation about making, as our colleague Caretha Mitchell likes to say, making our conferences less hostile for more people. You know, the thing about conferences and what they are supposed to do is that they are supposed to build and nurture community. That's what conferences are supposed to do. Most conferences, especially in the sciences, but also in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, often have the feel, though, of being a sort of in-person journal event where people are reporting findings or reading their writing. And so that focus on building community as the primary function of a conference gets lost, where you often feel like a kind of recipient of others' data, you know. What I love about ASTR is that its structure really is a kind of novel way for building community when it's done right. And that's because of that dual structure. You've got working groups which are building on a smaller scale communities around a particular topic with work in progress, which is great. And then you've got plenaries, which are meant to be audienced by larger percentages of the attendees. And their purpose is really to build community in a larger way for the conference. I love that about ASTR. The theme of that of any year's conference is not really incidental or accidental to that project of building community. It's supposed to be central. It's supposed to be about building a common vocabulary for everybody who's attending, whether they're participating in a working session or giving a plenary talk. And I want to point that out because one of the first questions I know I often ask and others ask is, do I really have to shape my work around, around that year's theme? And, all of the annual CFPs always make it a point to say you have to incorporate this theme in some way. And I think what gets lost in that demand and that sort of concern on the part of applicants is the fact that these themes really are supposed to be about giving us all a common vocabulary, giving us all something that we can count on in the interest of building communities. So the theme is really important. When it comes to making a proposal itself and to giving a plenary that you're eventually asked to give, the proposal that you put together really does need to contend in some way with the theme, not just the sort of title of the conference, but the way that the conference planner or planners have narrativized that theme in their description of that year's events. But in my opinion, when I sit down and write a proposal, one of the things one of the jobs I give myself, the place I start, is from the question, what kind of community am I trying to build? Am I trying to nurture with this talk? Like, who am I calling in? How does that intersect with the larger project of building a community at the conference? And how can I frame and structure this proposal in the interest of calling in all those folks, in the interest of building community, because that's what these conferences are supposed to be for. Just a couple other little things I think are really important for me when I put together a proposal. Remembering that a plenary talk is not an article. It's not a book chapter. It really is meant to be bite-sized. It's a taste of your work. Not a sort of, again, thinking about other conferences, not a report on the research you've already completed. It's not data production. In my, the plenary talks I really enjoy are those that are inviting me to think with the person who's spent a lot of time working on this particular project or this particular question. I think that people, I generally really respond well to people who've taken a sense of aesthetics, a sense of production into consideration. So thinking about their writing as literature, as something that has beauty and rhythm and tone and voice to it. People who plan any kind of multimedia, making that a part of building community, which includes making that media as accessible as possible to everybody in the room through description and so on. People who actually time themselves and rehearse and make sure that they're doing what they've been asked to do within a 15 to 20 minute time period. And so sort of circling back to that second thing I was describing, the bite size quotient, when I read proposals for plenaries, I want to feel like there isn't so much in this thing that there's no way I can imagine the person giving the talk in 15 to 20 minutes without making audience members feel nervous or anxious about just the amount of information that's being shared. And so to end where I started, for me, the most important thing is when I read plenary proposals and when I listen to plenaries is thinking about the community that the speaker is wanting to build and how they plan to do that in concert with the theme that's been announced for that particular year. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Our next panelist will be Professor Canning.
Hi, thank you so much, Eric. I'm Charlotte Canning. I'm at the University of Texas at Austin, a white woman, blonde hair, blue turtleneck with the sort of corporate background. I really appreciate that I get to follow Patrick because I think he put a lovely frame on our conversation today and brought up some of the larger issues that's going to give us some of the freedom to be able to go on some more specifics. So I really appreciate that. I guess I should also say, just to give some context, I've had various roles with ASTR, but probably the two most pertinent here are I organized or co-organized with some amazing scholars the last ASTR of the before times, so the last one before COVID, and no, we didn't know that was the case when we were doing it, and I'm also a past president of ASTR. I wanted to focus today on what makes a good abstract, because I think that one of the things I've found both in my work in the field, reading abstracts for various things, not just ASTR, but also as a teacher, it's one of the hardest skills to build. And I find it's often very frustrating to be on the receiving end of a promising abstract, but that doesn't really nail stuff down enough so that you can feel confident as someone selecting it, that what you're choosing is going to deliver the sort of vague promise of the abstract. A really, really good abstract is almost the entire paper in one paragraph. What does that mean? Obviously, it doesn't mean very small font, because most of the folks who are reading those are super old. We can't read that anyway. I remember going to a CV workshop when I was a junior faculty, and one of the panels actually said that, don't go below 12-point font because a lot of people on search committees are old and can't read those CVs. So I've been diligent about that ever since, and now I'm happy. And now I need to be on receiving end of that. What I mean by that is that even if it's only a sentence or two, you want to make sure you're covering all the kinds of sections in your abstract that would ultimately be expanded in your paper. So you need a really good introductory sentence. You need one that makes the person want to keep reading. A retired editor from the University of Texas Press once told me, and this was in the way before times, that she would stand in the mailroom at UT Press, open the unsolicited cold call manuscripts or proposals, read the first two sentences, and if they didn't grab her, she'd just open her hands and let them fall into the recycling bin. So, which had to do a lot with the kind of volume she was including. But think about that, like, what makes me want to read your second sentence? You need to give us a sense of how the work will be structured. What are you doing in this? What are the things you're going to do in the paper? You need to give a sense of method. And I want to pause about method, because method can often be an excellent way in, because plenaries tend to be about either the entire attending members coming together or a really high portion of them. So you're not going to find everyone is going to be working on a particular subject or a particular area of the discipline, whether it's geographical or time period or theoretical approach. But if you can promise something that has an interest for everybody, for example, we've all experienced when we've learned really exciting, important things methodologically from works that have nothing in content, have nothing to do with our own research, but are offering us new ways of thinking. So really giving a sense of how you're doing what you're doing is really important. And then don't forget to give us a sense of what your contribution is going to be. You know, why should 700 people sit and listen to you? Right? What is it that is bringing folks together? And that's also about, for you, making the right choice, because sometimes it's really, that's not what you want. What you want is the smaller group where you might have a really focused and intense conversation with the very folks who are also working in adjacent areas. So also, you know, because I know sometimes in ASTR, there is this sort of shimmer and shine that attaches to being on the plenary. And, you know, that's not untrue, but at the end of the day, you're spending money and time. And so make sure you're also getting something for your work, or you might as well stay home. You know, conferences are not cheap. So spending money and going home and saying, wow, I talked to, you know, scholar A, B, and C and got some great feedback. And now I can, this is going to become an article or a part of my dissertation or a chapter in an anthology or whatever it is. And I feel like I have gotten a kind of a form of peer review is one of the most valuable things you can walk away from a conference with, you know, sort of under your belt. So I really, really urge you to also decide, maybe this isn't the best plenary paper, or maybe I won't get what I need out of being on a plenary. But if you think that that is how you would be well served, really, really make sure that your abstract is an incredible roadmap to how, to the work you're doing and why that work is incredibly compelling. And again, following a key point that Patrick made, please read the call closely and think about, in a really deep way, about how your work might address it and also address varied scholarly interests. So maybe you're going to offer a different view, maybe you're going to take it apart, maybe, you know, there's so many multiple ways to do it. And what you're also should feel, I think, empowered to do is perhaps suggest ways of thinking about the theme that perhaps the organizers didn't. I mean, all of you who've taught know that incredible joy that comes when the student comes up with a way of thinking about the prompt or the moment in class that you had never even considered. And so that's the same at conferences. So do feel free to like really get in and play with and think through the possibilities that the theme is giving you. I think anytime you can frame it as a positive, like, oh, I've never thought about my work in terms of hope, which is this year's theme. What would it mean to do that? And so those are the things that I really wanted to cover. And it really is the plea about the good abstract, because I want to finish where I started, which is by saying a lot of times we get abstracts, we read them, there may be a good idea, but we're not sure how the person is going to actually do that. Or we're not sure that the person has actually done the work that they're saying would be really cool. And again, of course, with any abstract or grant proposal, you're always in a way writing as though you've finished everything and you're doing it months ahead. So of course you may have things you're yet to do, but the sense of that this person is really totally embedded, immersed, and just delighting in the work that they're doing, and that the things that they're focused on is so important. And the abstract is the place to do it. And the other thing that's just sort of a postscript benefit to writing a really good abstract is you write your really good abstract, you submit it, you get accepted, yay! And then you have a whole life. And then suddenly it's time to write your paper. And you say, if I may be permitted, oh, fuck, what did I say I was writing about? Ha ha. If you write a crap abstract to get accepted, your abstract is not going to help you write a good paper. If you write a really good abstract and get accepted, suddenly your paper's mapped out. And basically you can take each of those sentences and they're your sections, done. Of course, I'm making it sound far easier than it is, but that is also the point of workshops like this, is to tell you how easy it is and you're going to be great, which is true. So I will pass it back to Eric. Thank you. Got a little loopy at the end, but you know, that's probably, as a past president, I feel entitled to demonstrate what the office did to me. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Eric.
Absolutely. Thank you, Charlotte. So our next speaker will be Michelle.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Lou Carriger. I answer to any pronouns. I'm a little worried that my internet just froze. So co-panelists, am I okay?
I think you're okay on my
Okay,
side.
good. I've got almost shoulder length bobbed hair. It used to be blue, but I'm experimenting with how I feel about premature gray, or I like to think premature. I am sitting at my desk in front of a blue indigo curtain and a cabinet that I could not possibly open to show you the contents of, but it's very scholarly, I promise. And I am sitting on the campus of UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles, which is the unceded and ancestral territory of the Tongva Gabrielino people. Let's see, I think I said all of those things. So I have a fair amount of history with ASTR, although I think a little bit less than my co-panelists. So I have been on the conference committee. I have been the co-chair of the mentoring committee, and I'm currently a member of the executive committee. And I have also given one plenary at ASTR. And so I'm quite excited actually about how what I was thinking about is going to fit with what Patrick and Charlotte have already talked about, because my first thought when I am thinking about plenaries and how I sort of talk to people about demystifying and deciding to try to get involved is, when do you go for your first plenary? So I think this will dovetail nicely with Charlotte's focus on the abstract and Patrick's sort of bigger picture considerations. I think the time that I'll tell a personal story. I sort of didn't realize that plenaries were for me. I was a junior. I had gotten a tenure track job. I was sort of in the middle of my junior time. And a good friend from graduate school who was about 2 years behind me applied for a plenary and got it. And then I was like, oh, wait, are we plenary people now? And I realized that I hadn't ever thought about when is the right time to go for a plenary. So the next year I applied for a plenary and I got it. Now, that doesn't mean I didn't think about all the things that were already on the table, but another thing that I think many of us are trying to be strategic about when we are thinking about our participation in conferences is how this functions for us in the sense of establishing ourselves in a quite small scholarly field. So timing wise, another time to go for that first plenary is when you are ready to sort of debut. Remember, I'm a Victorianist, so I do think of people as kind of debuting into society at times. And so I think that's when you're an advanced graduate student or sort of on the job market and then at the junior level is a very good time to think about, okay, how do I establish myself now as a new member of this community and society that we're working on? And I want to do it strategically, right? I do it at the time when I need to be known by a wider number of people, but I also do it at the time when I'm ready to make that 15 or 20 minute very solid presentation of what my sort of initial contributions are to the field. So to go back to my personal story, I gave a plenary in Minneapolis at ASTR about cultural appropriation and the quote unquote kimono protests that happened at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 2015. And what turned out to be, this is not something that's in my book. It's not something that I had already been working on in my dissertation, but it was something that I knew was fascinating to talk about informally with scholars and that I became sort of obsessed with over time. So I knew that this was a topic that I had found that I believed I was the right person to write in order to move forward a conversation that was a conversation many people in the field were interested in, which is sort of like how to think about cross-cultural exchange, how to think about this question of appropriation, how we balance it with sort of an older and still compelling notion of cultural exchange or cultural appreciation. So I knew that I had sort of that bite-sized intervention, and I spent time to refine it into the conference theme. And I knew that that was the moment where I wanted to become more known in the wider community. And so that's what I worked toward. But then, of course, you also need to have time. I think about conferences in two ways, right? Patrick talked about building community and being in a conversation, which I completely agree with. And then there's also, especially when you're a graduate student or when you are looking for a job on the job market, there's that notion of showing yourself to best effect and to making yourself a desirable candidate in various markets. And I think many of us also use conferences for those reasons. And the plenary is a very, very big stage upon which to do that. So when going in for this opportunity, it was also important to know that I had the time to really refine that paper, to have it be on time. I tell my graduate students, don't go over 20 minutes. You could have the most interesting topic at minute 19, and at minute 21, it's not interesting anymore. So the time to build that presentation, to recognize sort of the opportunity, and use it to its full advantage, I think is timing wise the thing to be looking for. So I'll try to wrap it up and be quite quick and tight. I'll just say, in my own personal experience, the plenary went really well. It was kind of an amazing feeling to have had. That was pretty much easily the largest number of people who had ever sat and listened to one piece of my talking and thinking at one time. And that plenary did go on to become a full-length article that was then also well received in publication. And so it was sort of an incredible opportunity to have had that many people listen, to have a lot of people come up to me afterwards and have ideas and want to continue those conversations. And I felt really lucky that I had had a topic that had felt interesting and felt useful to that many people. And it really helped me to develop those ideas and move forward with it. So it's a great opportunity, and it, I think, deserves as much time and attention as you can give to it, as my colleagues have already been describing. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. Our final panelist is Patricia Ybarra.
Hi, everyone. I am a middle-aged woman with not the kind of experimental attitude that Professor Carriger has about premature gray hair. So I have dark hair. I'm wearing reader glasses because I also need them now to read small fonts. I'm in my office on the Brown campus, which is on Narragansett land and on land that is stewarded by the Narragansett people to the present day and into the future. There are a lot of bookshelves behind me, a sort of corporate fluorescent light that you didn't imagine it went off because I didn't make any movements when Professor Carriger was speaking. And so it might go dark again, but it seems if I gesticulate like I did, the lights come back on. And I'm also wearing sort of a white geometric blouse with some fluffy things, some fluffy femmy things. All pronouns are fine, but most people use she pronouns to refer to me. So I just want to say I took a bunch of notes about what to discuss today, and many of the things that I had noted have already been said. So I want to recap a few things and sort of put emphasis and amplify the voices of the people who've gone before me about a few things. The first is to normalize rejection of being a plenarist. I have been a plenarist. I have been rejected from being a plenarist. I have been rejected from being a plenarist and asked to do something else at the conference. So I have done all of those things. And so it is quite normal. So I want to do that. I also want to normalize the fact that you will likely be nervous. So picking up on what Professor Carriger has said, you want to make sure you're ready and you have the time to put in to really create a really good presentation, because it is not an article, but it is also normal, perhaps the first time or perhaps every time, that you might perform or give a plenary, to oscillate between excitement and some kind of imposter syndrome. Now, the reason I just want to say that that might happen to you, and you will be great and you'll come out the other side. But I experienced all of those things. I was someone who was accepted to give a plenary when I was an advanced graduate student. That's not, it happens, but it's not the most common version. And I was very scared, and I rehearsed a lot. And I wondered if they had made a mistake, but ultimately it worked out well. And it really did help me refine that paper, which became a chapter of a book. Because people have already sort of said a few of the things that I would say about abstracts, which is just to pick up on what Professor Canning said, I really like it when people tell me how they're going to do what they do, not just what they're going to do. I think that's an incredibly important part of an abstract. Because it is an important part of what we do is the how, but also it's a way for us to know that you can actually deliver the interesting project that you tell us about in your abstract. Because as someone who's read a lot of the abstracts, almost all of them have something really exciting. But if you tell me how you're going to do it, it's just incredibly important. Be on time, rehearse your media. These all seem quite obvious, but these are all things I want to underscore as well. And the last thing I'll underscore that other people have said is just that, you know, some people, I assume, might want to try to apply for a plenary every year, but there are different times when you might want to have the larger audience in terms of what your project is, and other times where you want to be in a work group and talk about it amongst people who have some knowledge of your field and the particularities of it already. So all I would say is know that you find the right time, and know when it is that you want to have a conversation with a large audience, with people whose work might be very different from yours, right? And you can think that through a little bit. Because people have talked a lot about their experiences of giving plenaries or reading the abstracts, I wanted to say, I think, a little bit about what I think of as an audience member, going to a conference when I've seen plenaries that do a good job of talking to each other, and also to talk a little bit about the process. So the word demystify in the title, I think, is there because for many people, if you haven't yet served on an ASTR committee, you sometimes don't know how people are chosen, and you might think, well, only the really senior scholars get chosen, or only people who are doing this particular kind of research get chosen. But I want to talk a little bit about the process. So my experience on conference committees is, at least for the first 1 or 2 rounds of reading abstracts, you read them without names attached. And so in some sense, your person is detached from the idea. So that is something that I know, and I was like, maybe this will be too obvious, but my guess is a lot of people don't know that that's actually part of the process. So just know that often until the very final bit of the round, in which you have a number and you have to keep cutting back to get it a little bit smaller, you pretty much don't know necessarily whose abstracts that you're reading, actually. And I say that because I think that process is probably equally likely for people at different levels to feel disenfranchised in that project at some point, right? So if a very senior scholar submits an abstract and is not chosen, they might be very surprised. And part of the surprise might be that, well, your abstract, we really spoke from abstracts. We read abstracts, we did not read scholars. So I just want to point that piece out. The other thing I'll say, as someone who's been on a conference committee, but also co-organized a conference with Patrick, who's also here in the Zoom call, is when you're starting to really try to curate an event, you're trying to also find projects that are going to speak to each other. So that means having a relationship that is not superficial to the theme of the conference, but also eventually plenaries are not standalone. They're put in groups of 3 or 4. So you really are trying to put together papers that are going to speak to each other. And that is another consideration down the line when you're putting together plenaries for a conference. So I think that's something else that people often don't know, right? I mean, the other thing that we'll say is that when I go to a conference, I feel like my best experience happens when I see speakers from different levels of career, from advanced graduate student to senior scholar, from different ethnic and other forms of backgrounds, and also with scholarship that is in fact global in reach. So as someone, I think of a generation who's like on the cusp of when I think ASTR got more global consciously in its scope. I know Professor Canning was also there in the brief before times when that wasn't always the case, which we can talk about. I think that's a consideration people really take they take seriously when they put together a conference. And I guess if you think about that, my last thing to say is that sometimes you won't get accepted to one conference, and you might fit much better in a conference 2 or 3 years in the future with a different theme and sort of a different frame. So you should not assume, for example, that if you were not accepted, that your work is never going to be the kind of quote unquote work ASTR wants to present. It might just be that a different conference with a different theme and a different focus might make more sense for your work at that time. So I say all of that just to demystify that process a little bit. I'm glad to talk about, take questions on that, but I really want that to be clear, because I think that is one of the, not understanding the process might be one of the things that mystifies the process. A couple of other things that maybe are a little bit, that spin to things other people have said, but I also think is important, is I know when I have the experience of going to a conference and someone gives I think 90% of the time I'm very interested in the plenaries. I would also say that there are times when a plenary doesn't meet my expectation. And I would say that when a plenary doesn't meet my expectation, it's not usually because it's not quote unquote good work. It's often when I think that the speaker hasn't refined their work enough to be seen in that particular venue. And I understand how disappointing it can be to see a plenary that doesn't meet that expectation when you yourself have not been selected to be a plenarist. I'm just gonna normalize having that ugly feeling. It's okay to have that ugly feeling, right? But again, we go on abstracts, and we don't control people's works lives between when their abstracts are accepted and when they give the paper. But that's all to say, like, you can normalize that feeling. But I would just ask you to have your feelings, but also to recognize that that shouldn't dissuade you in any way for bringing your work again if you haven't yet had your work seen. And so that's the other thing I would say about that. I don't know that I have any other great giant revelatory thoughts. Really engage with the theme. Don't shoehorn into the theme. I think show that you have a voice, but just practice good citational practices in relationship to your ideas and your abstracts, which I think echoes a bit about what Professor Canning has said. And just know that there are people on the other side of this process reading your work with great care. And that, in fact, we know that the conferences are both building community and presenting ourselves professionally. And there's something that can be really mixed about that can be really complicated, I think, especially if you're emerging in the field as a junior scholar. But this is more me just saying to encourage you to know that there is a process. It's not a process that's going to make perfect sense every time. Clearly the lights want to go off, but that there is a really important process there that's actually quite laborious. It's a really interesting process to be a part of. So for any of you, I would also use this moment to pitch actually volunteering for committees like this, so you can learn the process actually, because it is actually really hard. And the last thing I'll say, which sounds like a platitude, probably it's a platitude in letters I've gotten, which is to say, we had so many more worthy applicants than awards we had to give. But let me tell you, there are many more worthy abstracts than there are slots in the actual conference. So I'm going to just leave it there with the transparency about process. I'm glad to talk more about my experience of giving plenaries later, but I always find it a little terrifying, and I just deal with that by over rehearsing. And that says a lot about why I'm not an actor and I'm on the Zoom call instead. So thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, and thank you for demystifying some parts of the process. So we're going to transition to the Q&A at this point. We do have a question in the chat that we can start with, and please invite any or all of the panelists to chime in for this. And this is from Carla Nuis. Is it important as an early career scholar to propose an abstract on a topic that is characteristic of your overall work or book project, or is a side project also appropriate in terms of debuting yourself as a scholar?
I have an immediate answer to this, which is, I think something that you will be proud to be associated with in the minds of the people at the conference is fine. I don't think it necessarily has to be from your book project, but it does have to be something that you want people to remember you in conjunction with.
I'll just jump in.
Oh, you go.
No, you go, Charlotte.
I was just going to say I differ a little bit. I think especially for folks who are about to be, going to be, or on the market, it can be very helpful to be able to point to the fact that your major focus, the thing that will become your book. And of course, this is for print scholars who are going to end up at places where a book is the sort of the standard of measure. It can be very helpful because it's an early form of peer review. So to be able to say,
Right.
you know, I gave a plenary at ASTR last year, and it was taken from X chapter of my book, is also a way of saying that my work is of interest nationally. That's not like a rule. So I think Michelle's point is well taken. Good work is the most important thing to do. But I do think there is some value there, but I don't think it should be treated like the hard and fast, you know, yes or no type thing. You go right ahead, Dr. Ybarra. I'm sorry I talked over you.
No, I was just going to say it probably depends on what your goals are. So I agree with both panelists, actually. So if your goal, one of your goals in giving the plenary is to familiarize your audience with your book project, certainly I think that's a good idea. That's probably the more traditional way to go. That being said, if you have a good side project that is really methodologically interesting, I don't think it's a mistake to present that, but it really depends on what your goal is, right? Because the other thing we haven't talked about is we've talked about how plenaries aren't articles or aren't book chapters, but publishers are at ASTR watching plenaries. So if your goal, say, is to get a book contract, if that's what you're doing at the conference that year, then of course, thinking about how your plenary would be helpful to you, having conversations with publishers, certainly take that into consideration.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So in one of my other roles, I co-edited a book series at Northwestern University Press. And at the beginning of every conference, my co-editor, Nick Rideout, and I sit down with the program and go through all the titles and abstracts if they're there. And we essentially divvy them up according to, you know, looking for projects that we think we'd like to recruit into the series. And we go to plenaries and occasionally working sessions at ASTR, but more often the plenaries, with the goal of talking to the speaker afterwards and setting up a meeting with them to talk about their book. Journal editors do the same thing, especially for special issues of journals. In fact, some special issues come out of conferences where editors have gotten really excited by a given theme they hadn't considered before. So if you are near the beginning of your career, if your particular job requires a book and or you really are aiming to publish a book, then I think Charlotte's advice is really good to keep in mind. And Michelle's comment that this is what you're going to be known for. This is sort of your debut to a much larger community. So great question. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question that just popped up. Elena, did you want to ask it yourself?
Okay. When you think of what stage you kind of worked, or the stage at which you wanted to share something from a research project, when did that, I guess, I write better than I talk, obviously, but I'm thinking about joy as also part of the research project process and how it might be productive. And so are there any personal examples you have of which particular stage you found most rewarding to share something as part of a plenary?
Can I go first, please? Because I have
Yes.
I have a negative example. I have an inverse example. So thank you so much for this question. Because the community that I was talking about building should also be a community that involves you, right? Hopefully with positive affect rather than negative affect. I'm not going to talk about the specifics, but I can remember a couple of talks I gave, one of which was a plenary at ASTR, and on the same topic, but a different talk, a plenary or a keynote actually somewhere else. And I gave these two talks at the beginning of working on a project. So I had done enough work to invest in this writing and to believe that I really wanted to write this thing, and to invite others into that vulnerable state of maybe starting to work on something, but feeling like everybody's already said this thing or done this thing. And, you know, the imposter complex that that Patty described and so on, all of that. But I felt very excited about the opportunity to give a talk on this thing that I was going to be writing a book on. And while I did get a lot of positive embrace at those two events, I also got a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, I got the right amount of negativity. People who, hopefully there aren't a lot of these folks hanging out at ASTR anymore. But you know, the kind of feedback that, especially this was when I was pre-tenure, the kind of feedback that really throws you off and makes you, it sort of plays on the negative affect of being vulnerable and giving a talk. And if I could go back, I might choose not to do those talks because you know, I haven't finished that project. I'm not sure I'm going to finish that project. I probably will. It was a long time ago. I've done other projects since. But if I do finish the project, it will be very, very different from what I talked about then. So this is not to scare anybody at all. It's just to say that thinking about what you're looking for in emotional ways, and you know, plenaries are also, as much as they're about building community, hopefully you're also asking for affirmation from folks, and you might not get it. You might get people who don't want you to, you know, or think they know better or what have you. So that's my example. I've also had the experience of getting the kind of boost that I needed from these kinds of things, but I'll stop with the negative affect example.
Well, I'm going to lean back into joy, although it's not that I've never had those moments of the kind that Patrick is talking about. You know, I think I would say that my most positive kind of plenary experience was a co-written plenary, actually. I did a plenary with another scholar, John Rossini, and we did it at the very beginning of a thinking project that ended up being a co-written article. And what was great about it is that we were sitting on a lot of data, but we were trying to really come up with a workable way to understand some really kind of disparate ideas that came to us. And so I feel like the process of doing the plenary early on in some thinking about kind of big structural historical shifts was really, really helpful in terms of us having a relationship as co-writers. So, I mean, I could say the same about co-chairing a conference with Patrick, but I feel like I really liked co-writing a plenary. It seems like a really unwieldy thing to do in a short time, but it was actually really, really lovely. So I would say that that's my rose to Patrick's thorn today.
This is an interesting question to me. I usually say that, at least for myself, I really prefer conference presentations and giving conference presentations. And I'm thinking more of like a typical panel, not necessarily the plenary, at an earlier stage of writing, because I really hate going to a paper where everything is already hermetically sealed. Like, I don't want to hear someone read out a publishable article at a conference, because what am I doing there? Like, why? You don't need any edits. You don't need to develop anything if every idea is already hammered down and there's like no place for discussion. Usually the plenary, because it is such a big stage, and I think of it as sort of like a level up from a typical panel, or definitely a level up from a working group. When I gave my one plenary, I had already done a sort of more informal conference discussion, sort of roundtable airing of the same ideas one time before I gave the plenary. And I think I landed my plenary at exactly the right moment. I was sort of halfway between the germ of the idea and the finished article that it became, where I had enough to go on that I was like, I've got a thing that I want to like grab people at, I want to grab you in the reception and I want to talk to you about this wild thing that was happening. And I'm so excited about it. But it's not yet totally hammered down, and I haven't like sort of answered every question or like, finished dotting every, I've almost said dotting every T and crossing every I. And so that felt like a good moment. And it also reminded me, while I have the floor, I'll just add something that Professor Ybarra was saying about imposter syndrome, which is like so real, right? I'm sure everyone in this room, I think, knows. But after many years of teaching speech, I try to relabel that fear as necessary excitement. And I think a thing that gets you through things like plenaries is to harness that excitement about figuring out the next step in the argument, or deciding what else needs to be said, and trying to really think of your opportunity, your encounter with the audience, as the time that you're going to get to figure out those next things. And maybe it's helpful to have a structured question for like, here's what I need to know from the audience, as opposed to just sort of like laying every aspect of your unfinished, totally vulnerable self bare to that moment.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Something that Charlotte brought up that I'd like to ask the panel about is this idea of kind of the plenary as peer review, which is, when I was in graduate school, it was presented to me as that way, as sort of like the job of, I mean, maybe that's like the very old school way of thinking about it, but that you get up in front of a bunch of people and you could get comments. And it sounds like from any number of folks, which, and thank you, Patrick, for sharing, that can be a kind of a very negative experience too. But I'm wondering, how do y'all see the role of the plenary now at ASTR?
If I could just clarify,
Yes.
although now I feel I am the OG, I guess. Uh, my first ASTR being well back in another century. I don't know if it is peer review or not. I said you could pitch it that way. So what I'm saying, it's a savvy use of getting accepted rather than whether or not you're going to actually get feedback that actually helps you make your work better. But in things like cover letters, interviews, you can say, well, it was accepted. And, you know, this kind of acceptance is a form of peer review. I've actually pitched books that way, where I've said, I've presented these two parts of this manuscript to in these large national or international societies and got in competitive submission, and it was accepted as a way of saying, see, the larger field is worthy, or is sees the work as interesting and helpful. So mine is a much more cynical use of this and careerist, which doesn't exclude ideas of joy or other functions of the panel. What I'm saying is, should you end up with any kind of adjudicated acceptance to a conference, use it, use it, use it. My first conference paper ever, 1927, I handwrote it on a beautiful piece of vellum, was in an adjudicated panel for the Theory and Criticism focus group of ATHE. And I used the fact that it was adjudicated to sort of say, look, my work got selected. So that was my cynical 2 cents, as someone who's mentoring graduate students and trying to help them use what they got. So I'll just go back here and let the other people say the other things.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
The 21st century things.
So your question is, how does the plenary function today, right?
Yeah.
I think, you know, there are caricatures of academic conferences that are also true. And the Q&A of a plenary and the sort of periphery, the liminal space of the hall after you've finished a plenary and and it's over, but you're talking to people and so on, really can be and is sometimes that space where people who have sat and ostensibly listened to the plenary want to make their own plenaries happen. You know, Q&A questions that are not questions, the sort of joke about my question isn't really a question, it's more of a thought, and then the question after is, so what do you think of that, or something. That is a caricature that is true. And I think I'm sorry to be so Debbie Downer today, because there's so much joy I get from this community and from conferences and so on, but it really is a part of the experience that plenaries become arguments. People do come up and tell you that you've got it all wrong, or tell you that you're trying to take something away from them, how dare you, or, you know, that does happen. And there is something to be learned from most of that, not all of it, but most of it. But more often and more joyfully, I'll be the rose this time too. I'll be my own rose. You also get so many people at ASTR who are so excited by what you've talked about and want to push you in some way. I've had experiences where someone came up and picked up on some small thing I had talked about and pushed me on that thing that then led to an entire paragraph when I wrote this thing, you know, when I converted this into a journal article, and a long footnote, you know. I've had people who, in talking to me, helped me reframe my thinking and re-elaborate a description of something, or or what have you. So in my experience of the plenaries, putting aside for a moment the one that felt that seemed to feel, you know, more negative, in my experience, they really do operate as a kind of peer review because others are engaging you in that kind of critically constructive way. And it really does feel like that. Like in terms of the spectacle of ASTR, I think plenaries do still have that sort of spotlight draw. They do sort of feel like the thing up on the stage that everybody is watching. They do sort of have that sheen. I'll stop there.
I would like to report a little bit from recent EC meetings. So, oh, and speaking of normalizing failure, I ran for the EC, I think 3 different times, and I have been defeated, and then I got elected. And man, I'm glad I lost that second time, because it means I didn't have to be on the EC during the pandemic or the strike. So be okay with losing things. That said, I would like to report back a little bit from, which I think is fair to do, from the EC, which is that the discussion of the status of the plenary is sort of under debate now. So Eric, you asked a question, right? It was sort of like, what does the plenary do today? And I think it corresponds to a larger question that I've really been wrestling with over the last few years, which has to do with how we balance representation and diversity in a really, really broad sense, and including sort of like intellectual and methodological diversity in our profession, along with rigor, basically. So the plenary itself, I think it's fair to say, has functioned as kind of a peak, right? This is like an ideal. It has typically, and it popularly is thought of as very senior people, the most important stuff, a centerpiece of the conference. But I think that is changing, and it's changing also in the way that organizers and the leadership of ASTR and conferences in general think. We are beginning to think more and more representationally, right? And so that's where we get more of these changes, which are about seeing from a variety of people at different career points, with different geographical focuses, with different methodological focuses. But it remains a major point of debate how we balance and how we think through and recalibrate what we may typically have thought of as kind of quality or rigor, right? When we throw out everything that we've inherited in terms of what good, best scholarship looks like, and try to compare a whole bunch of scholarships that may not really be easily comparable. So I think the bottom line is there's still going to be more applications for plenaries than there will be slots in plenaries. And so it is an open and active debate about how we portion these out, as people are simultaneously trying to rethink how we can be better and smarter and less sort of exclusive about what quality looks like. And I do think that we are seeing that behind the scenes, right? It's being demystifying. It's an active debate. Like, in what ways has the plenary functioned as exclusionary, and what are the smart things that we can do to make it much more inclusive, much more accessible, and still be an important centerpiece and still be competitive. It's just still going to be competitive. I saw lots of faces during that, so I'd love to hear from others.
I mean, I'll say 2 things. I want to first go back a little bit to the peer review question. Then I think I want to engage the sort of what I call like the affective drag of the idea of the plenary historically. And I'm going to say this I'm going to say this knowing that when I say that Charlotte was there before I was, I'm not talking about vellum. I'm talking about 8 to 10 years. And a lot happened in that sort of decade when Charlotte Canning was a junior into an associate professor, and I was a grad student into an assistant professor, right? And I just want to make that generation clear. The first thing is that what's great about the big hall of the plenary is, and it's also the thing that's the risk that can make it a not good thing. So I want to say that it's a bit of ambivalent, is that because it's in some sense you're in a big audience with people who do not know you and might not know your scholarship because they're not in your field. Sometimes people can ask questions about the very basic tenets which you thought were the givens of your argument or your work. And that can be both totally amazing and totally destabilizing. And that's one way in which I think it's really important peer review, is that it's not often that when I give a plenary, it's like, oh, someone talked about this one little detail that I have questions about. It's often that I have a supposition of value underneath my plenary that I assumed was absolutely correct and not up for question. And really good questions from generous interlocutors can actually ask you to question those suppositions without stultifying or being, I'll just say it, ridiculous. Okay, I have not used the F word yet, Professor Canning. So I want to normalize one other thing before I say something about the history. So my fear often when I'm in this group, because I do know every other panelist, either through peer relation or having been mentored or having mentored someone on this panel. And so I know that in these situations where we are being familiar because we are familiar, that can feel really intense, especially when you're at the beginning of your career and you're like, how do I break into that? So I want to say that it's a small field, and for all of you, you have all these relationships, and in 10 years, you're going to be on a panel like this and you're going to know people, right? So I don't want that familiarity to feel exclusionary, but I also don't want to obfuscate the fact that I've collaborated with every other single person on this panel intellectually at some point in my career. And that is why I'm trying to remember to say Professor X instead of blah first name. So the other thing I'll say, and this is actually to Michelle's point, right, is that in different iterations over the last 10 or 15 years, I think that different conference committees and different ECs have tried to make inroads into the sort of clubby or exclusionary nature of the plenary and what role the plenary has in relationships to other part of the conferences. And I think we're in another pretty intense moment, I think, of debate, I think it's fair to say, about it. So that's one thing. But the other thing that was dragged is something that I remember as a graduate student, which was that there was a time in which the plenary is exactly what we told you it wasn't, which is this is a yearly reporting of findings of a very small group of scholars who already know each other. And I don't find that to be a case anymore, but damn it, if that emotional affective drag of its history of it being that doesn't sometimes feel present, even when the conditions we're in are not exactly that. So I want to acknowledge that there was that history. I walked in sort of at the tail end of that era, and it was intimidating and it got easier, but it's actually because of people like Dr. Canning, who I think fought some different fights so that it would be easier for those of us who came after to be in those conversations. So I just want to acknowledge that sort of spectrum of history of collaboration, not as an alienating piece, but just as a reality and sometimes the ghost in the room.
Can I just, first of all, thank you so much. That's very generous. And it is true. When I was president, we did start fighting some battles or continue some that others had started. I think it is worth noting how different this organization is. And in a way, despite sometimes its feeling of claustrophobia, it has both historically been not wanting to change and yet very open to change. So I attended my first ASTR in 1992, and I had finished my degree. Nobody went as a graduate student when I was a graduate student. It was not the graduate student conference. That was ATHA. Nobody who wasn't already, working, had a job, et cetera, went to ASTR. And I remember Oscar Brockett telling me that when he first started going, you couldn't even join. You had to be nominated by someone who was already a member and then be approved. So it really was a very clubby origin. And it was interesting when I was talking to some folks when we were in New Orleans about the changes that are being discussed. And I realized I had that first initial but but I was the one who did X or Y. And then I realized, right. And now someone else is doing something else because things have changed. So I think it's terrific to try different formats and to try different ways of understanding and viewing the function of both the organization itself and the annual conference. I also think that's a good way to remember, as everyone else has said in various ways, if it doesn't work out this year, maybe next year, right? Or maybe you get rejected this year and then next year it turns out it's like the perfect theme. So I do think it's always good to remember that it's just it's one of what will be many. And I know that that's easy to say when you're where I am, but I too have been rejected for plenaries. I too have had moments where I was rejected and then later was like, phew, because now I can be in this conference that's far better suited for what I want to do. And I didn't kind of blow it by being in a plenary, because I believe there is a rule, like if you were on one year, you can't, or there's some way of also ensuring that it's not the same people all the time, which is a good thing. So I just wanted to say, I think that's maybe one of ASTR's strengths, is that folks get on the executive committee and they start having conversations and good things come from it.
Well, we may have time for one more question if anybody wants to take advantage of having this enormous expertise here and these folks who have given some time. If you have a question, this is probably the last chance to do so, but I'll just, I'd like to thank each and every one of you. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Thank you to each panelist for providing this great commentary and yeah, so if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thanks so much.